Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about microeconomics using League of Legends. I would like to pretend this video is for some greater purpose about my passion in economics, but realistically, it is my way of studying for my AP exam, which is next Monday. And if this video is helpful to you at all, please leave a like and enjoy. So let's start by talking about the fundamental problem of economics: scarcity. Scarcity is just like how you have 6 item slots in League. You have to make choices on what items to buy and what items to leave in the shop. So, what items do you buy? That's where you look at the PPC curve, also known as the production possibilities curve. So, for example, this is the PPC curve for Lux as support. Lux can either build more shielding, which is on the y-axis, or more AP, which is on the x-axis. You'll notice several points on the graph. Let's take, for example, point A. Point A is inefficient because Lux built a D, which doesn't give her as much shielding and as much AP as possible. But, for example, if you look at point B or point C, they're both on the curve, which means that both of them are efficient, and Lux in this scenario is building items correctly. But, for example, at point D, that's impossible because Lux can't have that much AP and that much shielding at the same time. So, maybe achievable in a custom match. Okay, let's talk about cost benefit analysis. Companies use this all the time to analyze whether or not they should enter the market. In this scenario, should the Nunu flash for the kill onto the Renekton? You get the benefit of the 300 gold, but you might lose out on the flash and later on teamfights. So there's always a trade-off. Okay, let's talk supply and demand. Price, which is the skill required, is on the y-axis, and quantity, which is the amount of players, is on the x-axis. So, for example, let's take Azir, a normally harder to play champion, and the quantity of players is going to be less. But if we take someone easy, like Garen, we can see that demand for Garen is high because he is so easy to play. So here are some graphs with demand or supply shifts. An example of this in League could be if a champion is in the meta, then the demand for them will shift to the right. Or if a champion just recently got nerfed, then the demand for them could shift to the left. Also, remember that if both supply and demand shift at the same time, then either price or quantity is indeterminate. So here we could see the 5 shifters of demand, which is preference, related goods, income, the amount of consumers, and expectations, acronym price. And we can also see the 6 different shifters of supply: the technology, inputs, government regulations, so that'd be a tariff or a subsidy. And we can also see expectations, future expectations, related goods, and also disasters. Let's talk about the price elasticity of demand. You calculate this by putting the percent change in quantity over the percent change in price. Anything above 1, elastic. Unit elastic is at 1, and below 1 is inelastic. In League, someone like Yasuo has a lot of players that have inelastic demand because they will pick him no matter if he's in the meta or out of the meta and still end your games and go 0 and 10. But someone like Yorick Jungle will have elastic demand because they have low commitment players that drop quickly after he gets nerfed. Honestly, the price elasticity of supply is basically the same thing but for supply. And it's the same calculation, you just put percent change in quantity supplied over percent change in price. There's some other elasticities, such as cross price elasticities. For example, if Zeri gets nerfed, then demand for Lucian will increase because they're substitutes. But if the patch notes nerfed Yasuo, then the demand for Poppy will decrease because the Poppy is a counter to Yasuo. Sometimes, at special scenarios, government has to intervene. In our case, Riot has to buff certain champions. That'll be like giving a subsidy. And sometimes Riot has to nerf certain champions. That's when the government puts a tax on certain goods. There's 4 different types of competitions, and we'll start with perfect competition. Here, you can see the graphs for the market versus the firm, with the market being towards the left and firm being on the right. Some important things we have to point out are the profit maximizing rule, where you produce at MR equals MC. And we also have to come to realize that MR equals demand equals average revenue equals price, which is the straight horizontal line that you can see spanning across both the graphs. Some characteristics of perfect competition is that they have a low barrier of entry. For example, this champion does not take that high of a skill level to play, so everyone can play them. And they also don't have different products. I mean, you can only flash ult on Garen in one specific way. These firms don't make a profit in the long run because if they did, other firms will just enter the market, kind of like how everyone abuses one broken champion before they're nerfed by Riot. Here's the second type of competition, a monopoly. You can see that on top it's labeled as a market because the firm is essentially the market. A monopoly can make profit in the long run because of its high barrier of entry, meaning that other people aren't able to play the champ as easily, taking longer to learn. Profit here is shaded purple, and you can see it's between ATC and demand. You can also see that price is a lot higher than what it could be because a monopoly is inefficient. They produce less than the optimal amount and charge way higher than the optimal price. The third type of competition is monocomp. In the short run, it's very similar to a monopoly. However, the difference is that in the long run, it can't make a profit because of its low barriers of entry. Think of this as people abusing the meta. The other difference between monocomp and perfect competition is that it has slightly differentiated products. This is like how each jungler has their own jungle path. It's slightly different, but in the end, you get the same result. Let's talk about the fourth type of competition, an oligopoly, or a cartel. So, this is a matrix. The way you read this is that all the numbers to the left, aka the underlined ones, are player one's output, and all the numbers to the right are player two's output. So, we could read as player one, if they pick meta, then player two can respond with meta or fun, and player one can either make 2k or 4k gold. So, let's find the dominant strategy. So, player one's dominant strategy is to always pick meta because they make more when they're picking meta. Player 2 also has the same dominant strategy, is to always pick meta. So therefore, we end with the equilibrium at both players picking meta and 2k, 2k gold each. Let's go to Unit 5, which is factor markets. Factor markets are pretty straightforward. Let's look at T1 and Zeus. Over the past offseason, T1 had to say bye to Zeus. This is because Zeus is a world-class top laner and the demand for him is high. That means he is wanted at a lot of different firms. So his wage is also high, which means that T1 couldn't come to an agreement with how much Zeus is being paid. This is why T1 instead signed Doran, which isn't as in demand as Zeus, which means they could pay him a lower wage. And we can even see this in game as well. If the enemy had a lot of AP champions, then the demand for a MR tank such as Galio would increase. And if the enemy had more assassins, then a tank like Ornn or someone with high armor would increase. And let's look at the profit maximizing behavior. You would gank lanes where your effort produced the most value, which is where MRP equals the wage. And if you want to go pro in League of Legends, you're really competing for those international tournaments, which means it's a monopsony because there's only realistically one way that you can reach the top of League, and that's through Tier 1 and eventually Worlds. Alright, let's move on to the final unit, Unit 6. This unit is about market failure and the role of government. Let's first talk about efficient and inefficient outcomes. Fighting over drag while all being at 1 HP is an inefficient allocation of your resources because you could better spend the time backing and buying items. However, a backdoor win is an efficient use of map pressure. So, what are externalities? For example, if your mid laner is losing lane and you're playing ADC, that is a negative externality because the fed mid laner can roam down and destroy you. However, if your top laner bought Black Cleaver, that is a positive externality because it removes armor off the enemies in a teamfight, allowing you to do more damage. These are both market failures, which is why government sometimes has to intervene, which is like Riot nerfing certain champions, it's like regulatory policy. So, what are the differences between public and private goods? Public good is like vision. If you place down a ward, you can't deny other people on your team from seeing what your ward sees. It is non-rivalable and non-excludable. However, in the beginning of the game, if you got blue buff, that is rivalable and excludable, which makes it a private good. This is because if you have blue buff, nobody else can have the same blue buff. And let's talk about inequality. That's basically like different amount of gold that each member share of the team. For example, a fed ADC might share a lot more of the gold than a feeding mid laner. And we can see this on the Lorenz curve, which is a curve commonly used to represent the distribution of income or wealth. And we can also talk about tax. There's three main types of taxes: progressive tax, proportional tax, and regressive tax. Progressive tax the rich more, proportional is the same for everyone, and regressive tax the poor more. And that's it. Those are the main basic concepts of AP microeconomics. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Hope you found something helpful. And just a reminder, this is a very basic outliney video for myself to review, and it should not serve as the only thing in your study guide.